Hey, Lever Time listeners, this is David Sirota. This week was the 15th anniversary of one of the most consequential Supreme Court rulings of this whole era, Citizens United v. FEC. If you're not familiar with the case, you should be. In the case, the Supreme Court essentially gave corporations and the wealthy the power to spend as much as they want in our elections. Since the ruling, more than $58 billion has been spent on congressional elections. That's more than $10 million a day, every single day, for 15 years. That spending crescendoed in the 2024 election, which was the most expensive in history. And this past week, we saw Donald Trump take the oath of office with his biggest benefactor, Elon Musk, sitting right by him. It was Citizens United that allowed Elon Musk to use a super PAC to buy Donald Trump's loyalty and buy the election. In all, about half of the spending that supported Trump came from just 10 mega donors. Next week, senior podcast producer Arjun Singh will unpack how the fingerprints of the Citizens United decision are all over the Trump presidency. But first, I think it's really important for you to understand exactly how we got here. Fortunately, we here at The Lever told that story. In autumn of 2024, we released our new series, Master Plan, which is about the multi-decade fight to legalize corruption. And in one episode, we specifically look at the Citizens United case. So today, we're going to play that episode for you here, which will help provide some context for Arjun's episode next week. But this episode will also help explain our current dysfunction. In this episode, you're going to hear our exclusive interview with the lawyer who represented Citizens United and was the key architect of the case. You're also going to hear the little-known story of the Supreme Court justice who wrote the Citizens United opinion, stuff that's going to blow your mind. And you're going to understand that all the money buying American politics these days isn't some random accident. It was all part of a detailed plan to get that Citizens United ruling and then use it to help oligarchs take over America. But I don't want to give away too much. So here's that Citizens United episode from our Master Plan series. You can listen to the whole Master Plan series by searching Master Plan in your podcast app or going to masterplanpodcast.com.
This is one of my favorites. You know, to be on the front cover of the ABA Journal, it's like being a rock star, be on the front.
Yeah, it's like being an athlete on the cover of Sports Illustrated.
Exactly. And
This is attorney James Bopp. He's showing me all the memorabilia of his career scattered around his wood-paneled office. There's a framed letter from Ronald Reagan. There's a photo of him with Dick Cheney. And yes, there's him on the cover of the American Bar Association's magazine, the ABA Journal, with the headline, The Big Bopper.
I've seen it written that you filed more campaign finance cases than anyone else.
definitely.
More campaign finance cases than anyone else in the country.
My first big win in the Supreme Court was
In the Minnesota case?
the Minnesota case.
When we first reached out to Bob for an interview, we figured we'd be heading to meet him at some big fancy law office in Washington, D.C. or New York. Instead, he told us to meet him at his storefront law office in Terre Haute, Indiana. Terre Haute doesn't seem like a bustling hive of political intrigue and master planning. Here on this sunny day in late winter, it had the look of lots of Midwest towns whose boom days are long gone. There's an ornate courthouse and some big buildings in a sparsely populated downtown. It's basically the town from Parks and Rec, in a red state dominated by Ron Swanson politics.
It's never too early to learn that the government is a greedy piglet that suckles on a taxpayer's teat until they have sore, chapped nipples.
Terre Haute is where Larry Bird played college basketball, where socialist presidential candidate Eugene Debs was born, and where Timothy McVeigh was executed. But there's a good argument to be made that the Terre Hauter who's had the most significant long-term impact on America is this affable 76-year-old grandfather in a blue sweater and khakis. So the first obvious question I had for James Bopp was this: why does he live here, so far away from the political power brokers that he's trying to influence?
Well, I'm third generation Bopp in Terre Haute. Well, I've stayed here because of the culture. Married, had 3 daughters. We wanted a relatively conservative cultural environment. And even though Terre Haute at the time was 2-to-1 Democrat, culturally it was conservative.
Growing up, Bob's family wasn't especially political, but his dad did have some clearly defined views.
He was a doctor, and he really did believe in the Hippocratic Oath. Physician shall do no harm. And so he always thought, abortion was unethical. So I developed a lot of my conservative philosophy before I even got to high school.
Bob was really clear with us about this point. He's been an unabashed conservative for most of his life, and way before he ever cared about campaign finance, he was conservative about abortion. Just keep that in mind. After college at Indiana University and law school in Florida, Bob returned to Terre Haute and worked a stint at the state attorney general's office before becoming the general counsel for the National Right to Life Committee.
The mood is pride and achievement at this year's convention of the National Right to Life Committee. These anti-abortionists have successfully used sophisticated lobbying and public pressure to chip away at the 1973 Supreme Court decision that made abortion legal, and they intend to stay on the attack. The number of legal abortions continues to rise, but pro-abortion leaders are worried nonetheless.
I think my greatest concern is that they will affect power at the congressional level that is not, in fact, representative of the will of the people.
That pro-choice activists' fears were well-founded. Changing the political power equation was exactly what young James Bopp planned to do at the National Right to Life Committee.
They did not have a PAC. And one of my first things I was interested in doing was getting National Right to Life to create a PAC, because they needed to become more aggressively involved in political activity. And one way to do that is to contribute to candidates.
But in 1980, when the National Right to Life Committee published voter guides encouraging support for anti-choice candidates, the organization got in trouble for violating the old Federal Election Campaign Act. That's when Bopp realized that campaign finance restrictions were limiting his organization's ability to achieve its one big goal:
to design and implement a strategy to overturn Roe v. Wade.
Increasingly, it seemed like the way to do that was to deregulate the campaign finance system so that the anti-choice movement could get anti-choice politicians elected, who would then get anti-choice judges appointed to the bench. So Bopp began knitting the two seemingly separate causes together: the fight against abortion and the fight against campaign finance regulations. And he appropriated his strategy from probably the last person I would have ever guessed.
The NAACP strategy implemented by Thurgood Marshall in Brown versus Board of Education.
I mean, what? This hyper-conservative anti-choice activist lawyer was inspired by civil rights legend Thurgood Marshall? But it's true. He was. Bopp tore a page out of the NAACP's playbook. He started filing campaign finance suits, a lot of them, over and over, and seeing what took, what got accepted to higher courts, and which arguments worked to chip away at campaign finance regulations. And he kept his eye on the prize, the Supreme Court. He familiarized himself with the justices, their ideologies, and their temperaments.
See, I can't make the Supreme Court do anything. Anything. They are in total control of the cases they accept, the issues they agree to decide, and how they decide those issues. But in order to persuade them to do something, they've got to take my case. And the best case for them to agree to decide is one that gives them options. And if they're willing, they can go big.
In this episode, the master planners go big, really big. When we last left off, Justices John Roberts and Sam Alito had just replaced Sandra Day O'Connor and William Rehnquist on the Supreme Court. Now, with that new court in the late 2000s, James Bopp saw an opportunity to destroy decades of campaign finance laws in a single blow, using an obscure film about Hillary Clinton.
If you thought you knew everything about Hillary Clinton, wait till you see the movie.
But to win his case, Bopp needed to secure a vote from one of the most inscrutable and powerful men in America, Justice Anthony Kennedy.
Justice Kennedy has really kind of held the keys to all of these major decisions, and so there hasn't really been another swing vote like him.
I'm David Sirota, and this is Master Plan.
What about the master plan, huh? Thinking of a master plan.
Young Anthony Kennedy's life started in the non-glitzy, non-LA part of California.
Hello? Won't you join us for a trip depicting life in Sacramento, 1950?
Like the fictional Hill Valley from Back to the Future, Sacramento in the mid-20th century was bustling and all white picket fencey.
Many words have been written about tree-lined streets, beautiful architecture, majestic buildings, but nowhere in the world do they fit any better than they do in Sacramento.
But underneath the idyllic charm, Sacramento was also California's version of the swamp. As the state capital, it was teeming with lobbyists and politicians and their dirty money greasing deals over everything from oil and water to redevelopment and liquor. I imagine the city's ethos was like that line in Chinatown.
Politicians, ugly buildings, and whores all get respectable if they last long enough.
Anthony Kennedy was born into this swampy culture. His dad was a powerful lawyer and lobbyist who focused on the state legislature, running a reliable business of influence peddling and soft corruption. In 1963, his father died of a heart attack, and young Anthony took over the firm. He was only 27 years old. As a lobbyist, Kennedy soon became known for handing out campaign money to legislators on behalf of his clients. He worked alongside Ed Meese, a master planner we've mentioned a few times before, who had a close relationship with that B-movie actor from the Man Meets Monkey film, Bedtime for Bonzo.
Even a monkey brought up in the right surroundings can learn the meaning of decency and honesty.
Of course, by the early 1970s, that same actor was the arch-conservative governor of California, Ronald Reagan. And so while the U.S. Chamber of Commerce was holding its secret meetings about implementing the Powell Memo in 1973, the Chamber's California state branch was doing its part to put the memo's ideology into action, backing Governor Reagan's major anti-tax ballot measure, which it billed in Powell Memo-esque terms as an economic Bill of Rights. Who helped Reagan draft that ballot measure? Anthony Kennedy.
It is the most revolutionary and complicated tax reform ever to be submitted to a vote of the people. Proposition 1 would cut state income taxes, making them a little smaller each year. It would put a constitutional limit on state spending, allowing increases only as the total personal taxable income in California rises.
The tax proposition ultimately failed by hundreds of thousands of votes, but Reagan soon helped his pal Kennedy by getting President Gerald Ford to appoint him to a federal judgeship. Kennedy was just 38 years old when he was appointed to the bench, making him the youngest federal appellate judge in the country. Right away, Kennedy forged a reputation as mild-mannered and polite. Some might even say genteel. He was a conservative, yes, but not necessarily a predictable or totally ideological one. He had a reputation for supporting individual freedoms, read like a libertarian, and making narrow decisions on a case-by-case basis, rather than issuing sweeping ideological rulings. And he kept that up into the late 1980s, coming to be known as the leader of a conservative minority on California's more liberal Ninth Circuit. And then, in June 1987, journalist Bill Moyers asked the OG master planner, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell, how much longer he would remain on the court.
You've been here now 15 years. You're 80 years old. Any thought about retiring?
My health has not been good. I go to the Mayo Clinic with some frequency, but at the moment I have no present plans.
But then, literally the next day...
Good evening. Justice Lewis Powell, a courtly Southerner, surprised almost everyone today by announcing his retirement from the U.S. Supreme Court. His decision touched off a flurry of speculation on who the president will appoint as a replacement and how that will affect the direction of the court and, of course, the country.
That meant Anthony Kennedy's old pal from Sacramento, now President Ronald Reagan, suddenly had a chance to nominate a new Supreme Court justice. Want to guess who Reagan first picked to fill Lewis Powell's seat? Nope, not Anthony Kennedy. Reagan first went for the A-lister of the master plan cinematic universe, the one, the only, Robert Bork. Yep, that's the same Robert Bork who did Nixon's dirty work and who helped Gerald Ford get the Buckley v. Vallejo ruling. As you also heard a few episodes ago, when Reagan nominated the Rasputin-like Bork to the Supreme Court, Senate Democrats fought back. We told you that Bork got borked, but we didn't tell you what happened next. When Bork was voted down, Reagan's second choice was Douglas Ginsburg. Ginsburg had led the Reagan White House's deregulation agenda. He'd hobbled antitrust enforcement at the Justice Department, and he had just made an appearance at a Federalist Society event. I mean, he was no Robert Bork, but he was a pretty perfect master plan pick, right? Well, almost. Ginsburg was forced to withdraw from consideration in a very 1980s scandal.
Several conservative Republicans had urged President Reagan to withdraw Ginsburg's nomination after he disclosed he smoked marijuana in the 60s and 70s.
Listen, I remember this happening when I was a kid. Who smoked weed and when was a huge deal back then. So Ginsburg got borked too. Months after Powell's retirement, Reagan, just like Nixon in the early 1970s, was 0 for 2 in Supreme Court nominees. And just like Nixon with Powell back then, Reagan now needed to find a jurist who was conservative enough to get nominated, but who presented as liberal and reasonable enough to get confirmed. And so Reagan turned to his old Sacramento buddy, Anthony Kennedy.
Kennedy, are you worried or upset that you are, in effect, the third choice for this seat?
I'm delighted with this nomination.
Mr. President, why didn't you nominate Judge Kennedy the first time?
I have told you that all three, we came down to a final three, and that all three were so close and so well qualified that you could have almost thrown a dart.
Thank you for
going
coming.
by that decision.
Right away, Kennedy was seen as the nice guy alternative to the hard-edged Bork and the pothead Ginsburg. During his confirmation hearing, Kennedy's past career in Sacramento's influence peddling industry wasn't seen as a liability at all. In fact, Republican senators like Orrin Hatch seemed thrilled that Kennedy had experience as both an attorney and a corporate lobbyist. Here's Hatch at Kennedy's confirmation hearing.
Well, I see you as a person with your experience, both as an eminent lawyer, as a person who has worked as a lobbyist, as a person who might have a great deal of ability on that court to bring consensus about.
Democrats this time offered literally zero opposition to Reagan's Supreme Court nominee. Kennedy was unanimously confirmed on February 3rd, 1988.
Judge and now Justice Kennedy. Sounds good, doesn't it? Yeah. Takes a distinguished seat on the high bench.
At Kennedy's swearing-in ceremony, Reagan made sure to draw parallels between Kennedy and the man he was replacing on the bench.
One of the great gentlemen of the American judiciary, a justice widely acclaimed for his decency and fairness, Justice Lewis Powell. Like his distinguished predecessor,
That may have sounded placating to liberals, but in retrospect, it must have been reassuring to the master planners. Upon joining the court, Kennedy started to build a moderate profile on social issues. Notably, in 1992, he co-authored an opinion that reaffirmed Roe v. Wade. But he also opted to uphold some abortion restrictions. Meanwhile, for those paying close attention, Anthony Kennedy, the former corporate lobbyist, also started dog whistling to the master planners about corruption and campaign finance. He voted against and wrote the dissent in a 1990 case that upheld a state law preventing corporations from using their funds to support political campaigns. He voted to let political parties make unlimited expenditures to buy elections for their congressional candidates as long as they didn't directly coordinate with those candidates. And Kennedy voted against upholding certain provisions of the McCain-Feingold campaign finance law in that case you heard about in episode 6. But mostly for his first 17 years on the court, Kennedy was kind of a backbencher. You just didn't hear a ton about him. That all changed, though, when Sandra Day O'Connor and William Rehnquist were replaced by John Roberts and Sam Alito. All of a sudden, Anthony Kennedy became one of the most powerful men in America, able to instantly shift national policy on any issue that came before the High Court.
With 4 liberal justices and 4 conservatives on the Supreme Court, Justice Anthony Kennedy's swing vote will be key.
A moderate conservative whose votes on high-stakes cases are close to impossible to predict.
He's the man in the middle, the right-leaning justice who often swings left on some of the most hot-button cases.
After the Roberts-Alito Supreme Court takeover, Kennedy's rulings with liberal justices on LGBTQ issues, habeas corpus, abortion rights, they probably made it seem like he'd keep the court from going too far to the right. But conservatives knew that Kennedy's vote could be swung. So they began lining up to throw all kinds of cases at him and the new conservative majority on the court, like kids lining up to see Santa Claus. But as they say in Christmas Story,
The line waiting to see Santa Claus stretched all the way back to Terre Haute.
Back at his storefront office in Terre Haute, Indiana, James Bopp had his eye on deregulating the campaign finance system, a cause that Kennedy seemed especially amenable to. So Bopp elbowed his way to the front of the queue with a case that brought his 2 pet causes together, the crusade against abortion and the crusade to deregulate campaign finance laws.
But I can't tell the story without talking about the Wisconsin Right to Life.
Sure, yeah. Please.
James Bopp saw a new chance to try to go big.
It was absolutely critical.
Bopp is talking about FEC v. Wisconsin Right to Life, a Supreme Court case that was heard right after John Roberts and Sam Alito were installed, right when Anthony Kennedy was the new swing vote.
Wisconsin Right to Life contacts me and says that there's an upcoming vote on Bush's judicial nominees. Feingold, of McCain-Feingold fame, is up for election, and we want to lobby him, and the vote's going to be in September.
The special interest anti-abortion group Wisconsin Right to Life is now airing this TV spot.
There are a lot of judicial nominees out there who can't go to work.
But come this weekend, this ad and corresponding radio hits will be illegal. Why? Because who Wisconsin Right to Life or WRTL talks about in its ad.
Contact Senators Feingold and Cole and tell them to oppose the filibuster.
Those Wisconsin Right to Life ads fell within the 60-day window, or blackout period, before that year's general election, which made it subject to the restrictions of the McCain-Feingold campaign finance law, which, as you heard before, had been upheld by the pre-Roberts, pre-Alito Supreme Court. Under that law, the group couldn't mention Senator Feingold by name because that would be considered electioneering. So Bopp sued on the grounds that those restrictions were a violation of free speech. On April 25th, 2007, James Bopp argued that case in front of the Roberts and Alito Supreme Court. The questioning focused on whether the Wisconsin Right to Life ads were just issue ads designed to lobby, or whether they were a stealthy form of electioneering against a candidate in the election. Here's Justice Stevens questioning Bopp about the distinction.
Are you trying to convince us the purpose of these ads was to convince Senator Feingold to change his position on filibusters?
It was indeed. It was to lobby him about the upcoming vote.
Did you think that was a realistic goal?
Yes, as it turns out, because in 2006 we ran the same sort of anti-filibuster ads, and Senator Cole, now up for re-election, changed his position on the filibuster. So these things happen. In other words, people's positions are affected by grassroots lobbying, and at least people should have the opportunity.
Then Anthony Kennedy chimed in.
Is that called democracy?
I'm sorry. We are hopeful, Your Honor.
Ultimately, the conservative majority on the court, including the key swing vote, Anthony Kennedy, narrowly agreed with Bopp, saying that Wisconsin Right to Life's ads were not express political advocacy since they didn't literally tell people whether or not to vote for specific candidates. The court declared that Wisconsin Right to Life's ads could not be regulated by the McCain-Feingold campaign finance law. Here's Chief Justice John Roberts, once again play-acting as a baseball umpire.
Discussion of issues cannot be suppressed simply because the issues may also be pertinent in an election. Where the First Amendment is implicated, the tie goes to the speaker, not the censor.
Put another way, a mere 4 years after the old Rehnquist court dunked on the master planners and upheld McCain's campaign finance law, the new Roberts court had just sided with those same master planners and overturned a major part of that law. This was an Empire Strikes Back moment for the ages.
I call that the magic words case.
This is Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Whitehouse first took his seat as the junior senator from Rhode Island just 6 months before the decision in FEC versus Wisconsin Right to Life came down. He told us just how significant this little-noticed case really was.
That was the case in which Supreme Court decided what the magic words were, that if you used them in an ad, it became a political ad and was subject to a variety of regulations and limitations. But if you didn't use those magic words, then you could say that your ad was not a political ad, but it was issue advocacy. You weren't recommending a vote against Senator Whitehouse. You were just recommending that voters call up Senator Whitehouse and ask why he was a thieving, dirty, puppy-hating, anti-American scoundrel, right? The effect on the airwaves is the same, but if you didn't use the magic words about vote or elect, then this whole new avenue opened up for dirty political TV advertising.
Whitehouse said that the little magic words loophole started opening up the floodgates for unregulated, anonymous dark money ads that buy elections, all under the guise of educating the public with so-called issue ads rather than electioneering.
I think that was the purpose of the exercise. Here are the words that if you don't use them, you're good to go on election spending.
So you can see why James Bopp told us that the decision in FEC versus Wisconsin Right to Life was absolutely critical. It was a huge blow to the McCain-Feingold campaign finance law. But perhaps more importantly, it showed Bopp how this new Roberts-Alito court was inclined to rule on all of these campaign finance issues. Bopp also noticed something else. Arch-conservative Justice Antonin Scalia wrote a concurrence agreeing with the court's decision, but saying it should have gone a step further and completely eliminated McCain-Feingold's prohibitions against unlimited corporate spending to sway elections. The concurrence was backed by Clarence Thomas, hardly a surprise. But there was a third signature on the document. You guessed it, Anthony Kennedy. That was a signal to James Bopp that perhaps he could get Kennedy, the old Sacramento Swamp Thing, to channel his predecessor, Lewis Powell, and go huge.
I announced today that I'm forming a presidential exploratory committee. I'm not just starting a campaign, though. I'm beginning a conversation with you, with America.
It's early 2007. Hillary Clinton has announced her campaign for president. James Bopp is in Terre Haute, working on arguments that might get justices to go big in that Wisconsin Right to Life case.
So let the conversation begin. I have a feeling it's going to be very interesting.
And then one day, James Bopp's phone rings.
So I'm sitting in my office and I get a phone call from David Bossie.
David Bossie is a conservative activist. In 1992, he was working for a nonprofit that was first founded by the same people who made one of the sleaziest dark money ads in American history, the Willie Horton ad that shifted the 1988 presidential election that you heard about in episode 6. By 2000, Bossie was the organization's president. So James Bopp picks up the phone to talk to David Bossie.
Yeah, this is the Big Bopper speaking.
And Bossie asks Bopp if he'd represent his organization in a juicy lawsuit about Hillary Clinton that could end up letting corporations spend unlimited amounts of money in politics.
Oh, baby, you know what I like.
James Bopp likes big campaign finance cases, and this one might be the biggest of them all.
And he said, I'm working on a movie called Hillary the Movie, all right? And this is now early in 2007. I'm working on a movie, and she's running for president.
Hillary the Movie was promoted by Bossie as a documentary, but it was functionally just a hyper-conservative 90-minute anti-Clinton campaign ad with sad, scary music, all funded by a boatload of anonymous money.
She's deceitful. She'll make up any story, lie about anything, as long as it serves her purpose of the moment. And the American people are going to catch on to it.
I can't think of any other politician in history who has shown such a disrespect and a contempt for the Constitution and the rule of law as Hillary.
So Bossie was calling Bopp to figure out how to drop this thing into the 2008 election cycle while skirting campaign finance laws that apply to political ads during elections.
I want to broadcast this movie, and I need your help two ways, okay? First way is to make sure that our movie script does not have an appeal to vote for or against a candidate, because I want to be able to do this, and if it has an appeal to vote, I'm prohibited. So I want you to give me the advice to make sure that they could still do this movie.
The second thing Bossie wanted Bopp's help on was finding a legal way to get around the requirement to file a disclosure report about who exactly was funding the project.
The report would have required him to reveal his donors, and people would not want to contribute if they are going to be outed as funding an anti-Hillary, certainly critical of a Hillary movie, right? So he doesn't want to have to do this report of their donors.
This is something we've seen over and over again in our reporting. Conservatives want to be able to broadcast whatever messages they want, but they don't want to have to admit who is actually funding the message. And this quote-unquote movie was pretty nasty.
I knew Richard Nixon, and I'll tell you something, she's no Richard Nixon, she's worse.
Ruthless, vindictive,
venal, sneaky,
ideological, intolerant.
liar is a good one.
Scares the hell out of me.
So Bopp took the lessons he'd learned in the Wisconsin case, and he set about strategically assembling this new case using arguments that Roberts and Scalia and Kennedy had signaled they were sympathetic to. And just like his inspiration Thurgood Marshall in Brown v. Board of Education, James Bopp hoped this case would be the big one. Bossie's organization had run into issues with federal election regulators in the past. They'd tried to make some so-called documentaries before, but the Dark Money Group was clearly a political organization and not a movie studio. So more than once, the Federal Election Commission insisted that they were subject to McCain-Feingold's restrictions. Bopp anticipated a similar pushback on Hillary the movie. But rather than waiting for federal election regulators to send a cease and desist letter to Bossie, Bopp had a genius idea. He went to a lower court demanding a declaratory judgment up front, one that would officially allow Bossie to air his documentary right up until the 2008 primaries. In other words, Bopp took a play out of the Powell memo and used this case as a preemptive attack.
The greatest care should be exercised in selecting the cases in which to participate.
He used this obscure movie to create a case out of thin air. The lower court said essentially, no, campaign finance restrictions obviously apply to this. But that ruling gave Bopp what he really wanted, a way to appeal the case up to John Roberts, Sam Alito, and Anthony Kennedy on the Supreme Court. When Hillary the movie became a legal case, it ended up being named after Bossie's non-movie studio nonprofit. Maybe you've heard of it.
The Citizens United case.
Citizens United.
Citizens United.
Get rid of Citizens United and its pernicious effects on our electoral system.
Citizens United was appealed up to the Supreme Court in August of 2008. Hillary Clinton was long gone from the presidential race, defeated by Barack Obama. But that didn't matter. The master planners were after something much bigger. The court agreed to hear the case 3 months later. And then, David Bossie replaced James Bopp. Bossie bumped Bopp for a new hotshot attorney named Ted Olson. By 2008, Olson was already famous in master plan circles. He'd been a founding member of the Federalist Society and the Bush campaign's mouthpiece at the Supreme Court in Bush v. Gore, which decided the 2000 election. Supposedly, David Bossie had seen Olson win a Republican Lawyer of the Year award at an event in Washington, D.C. in October 2008, where another attorney called Olson the, quote, winningest Supreme Court lawyer. So when Bossie's challenge was accepted at the High Court the following month, he told his co-founder that they should ditch old James Bopp in Terre Haute and pick up Olson instead. like leaving prom with the popular girl. When Olson took over the Citizens United case, he slightly reformulated Bopp's argument. He focused on the idea that Hillary the movie was not what the McCain-Feingold campaign finance law was actually supposed to prohibit. It was a documentary movie that viewers had to seek out on video on demand, not a screeching election ad that couldn't be avoided on cable TV.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the Court, participation in the political process is the First Amendment's most fundamental guarantee. Yet that freedom is being smothered by one of the most complicated, expensive, and incomprehensible regulatory regimes ever invented by the administrative state.
It was Olson who first brought up the word corruption.
The government cannot prove, and has not attempted to prove, that a 90-minute documentary poses any threat of quid pro quo corruption or its appearance. Indeed, this documentary is the very definition of robust, uninhibited debate about a subject of intense political interest that the First Amendment is there to guarantee.
Olson argued with a straight face that Hillary the movie wasn't an election-focused ad governed by campaign finance laws, despite the fact that it was dropped in the middle of an election and spends 90 minutes insisting that Hillary Clinton was unqualified for the presidency and was, I'm paraphrasing here, basically the Antichrist. Justice Souter, for one, wasn't buying it.
Doesn't this one fall into campaign advocacy? I mean, I've got the government's brief open at pages 18 and 19 with the quotations. She'll lie about anything. She's deceitful. She's ruthless, cunning, dishonest, do anything for power, will speak dishonestly, reckless, a congenital liar, sorely lacking in qualifications, not qualified as commander-in-chief. I mean, this sounds to me like campaign advocacy.
Yeah, you think? In response, the master planners on the Supreme Court pretty much hijacked the oral arguments the same way your crotchety uncle pulls the well actually move to steer the Thanksgiving dinner conversation towards his bizarre theories. For example, instead of a discussion about money, influence, election buying, and corruption, what the case was actually about, Justice Sam Alito forced the government's defense lawyer into an absurd debate about book banning. Here's Kennedy.
Suppose it were an advocacy organization that had a book. Your position is that under the Constitution, the advertising for this book or the sale for the book itself could be prohibited within the 30-day period.
If the book contained the functional equivalent of express advocacy, that is, if it was subject to no reasonable interpretation.
They proceeded to get into an even more ludicrous debate about e-books that are accessed via satellite.
Within the 30-day period, if it comes from a satellite, it can be prohibited under the Constitution and perhaps under the statute.
I mean, this is a case about a movie. What are they even talking about? I feel like I'm Steve Martin in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles.
When you're telling these little stories, here's a good idea. Have a point. It makes it so much more interesting for the listener.
The FEC's lawyer tried to steer the justices back on track.
It can't be prohibited, but a corporation could be barred from using its general treasury funds to publish the book and could be required to raise funds to publish the book using its PAC.
That was the actual point. And unfortunately, the FEC's lawyer didn't make it very well. It wasn't really about whether the government could or would prohibit the publication of a book that urged its readers to vote or not vote for a specific candidate. It was about a corporation being able to anonymously funnel money from its coffers into election communications with no restrictions. And the government was arguing that they'd have to use a regulated PAC or explicitly disclosed political money instead. It's worth reiterating that none of this is what the original case was asking about. But as the ever more twisted and deranged arguments went on, the conservative justices like Anthony Kennedy kept insisting that it was a free speech question, even though it really wasn't. Then an hour later, it was over.
Thank you, counsel. The case is submitted.
What happens behind the scenes when the justices vote on this case is kind of my favorite part of the story.
This is producer Ula Culpa to tell us about when things got really interesting.
So, after oral argument, the justices meet in private and have a round of initial votes on the case. It falls basically along ideological lines, with the 4 liberals against Citizens United and the 5 conservatives, including Anthony Kennedy, in favor of saying that McCain-Feingold, BICRA, did not apply to Hillary the movie. Roberts gets to work on a narrow opinion saying that, but Kennedy writes a concurrence that argues that they should go way bigger and invalidate any campaign finance restrictions on allegedly independent political groups like Citizens United.
So Roberts and the other conservatives then compared drafts, and they love Kennedy's idea so much that Roberts withdraws his more narrow opinion and lets Kennedy write the majority.
Exactly. And this is where the drama hits. After Justice Souter sees what Roberts and Kennedy are planning to do, he gets pissed and writes a dissent. And it has become infamous in legal circles because it was this full-tilt, bridge-burning attack on the logic of his fellow justices, which is something that almost never happens, and definitely not like this. Reportedly, Souter berated not only the conclusions that Roberts and Kennedy had come to, but the, intellectual depravity to step outside of and way beyond what this case was asking in the first place.
Finally, someone was calling bullshit. Okay, so read us some excerpts.
Well, I can't.
Wait, why?
Because very few people have actually ever seen Souter's dissent. And that's because, not long after he drafted it,
Justice David Souter has informed the White House he will retire at the end of the Supreme Court term in June.
God, it's exactly like that scene from Half-Baked.
Fuck you, fuck you, fuck you. You're cool. And fuck you, I'm out.
Totally. And then John Roberts basically makes sure Souter's dissent never gets published as part of the official record. Because instead of the ruling coming out at the end of the court's term, like you might expect, Citizens United is suddenly scheduled for reargument in the fall.
What the hell is reargument?
It's when the court asks the lawyers to write all new briefs about all new questions. In this case, Roberts asked them to address big constitutional questions that signaled that the court wasn't going to issue a narrow ruling about one movie. It was going to follow Kennedy's lead and go really, really big.
So here we are in the fall of 2009. Things still seem all hopey and changey over in the White House, but only a few blocks away at the Supreme Court, shit is about to go down. The master planners had taken over the court with Roberts and Alito. James Bopp had given Anthony Kennedy the chance to go big, and Roberts figures out a way to make it all happen. This is like the master planners' A-team moment.
I love it when a plan comes together.
So 6 months after the first argument in the Citizens United case, David Souter is retired. His barn-burning warning about the end of democracy is nowhere to be found. The ideological terminator, John Roberts, rewinds the clock and lets Federalist Society luminary Ted Olson make a whole new argument to the court.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court.
This was no longer a little argument about a specific campaign finance law and a dumb documentary.
Robust debate about candidates for elective office is the most fundamental value protected by the First Amendment's guarantee of free speech.
Olson and his client, Citizens United, were now resurrecting the old free speech arguments from Buckley v. Vallejo and from Lewis Powell's Bellotti ruling that you heard about in Episode 5. Essentially, they argued that money is protected speech. They also argued that corporations therefore have a constitutional right to spend unlimited money in elections as long as it's not directly coordinated by candidates, and that such independent spending isn't a corrupting force. The justices seemed supportive of that view. John McCain said they seemed totally out of touch with reality.
I was rather disappointed in some of the justices' apparent naivete as to how corporate and union and unlimited money affects the legislative process. Does anyone believe that the rights of average citizens to be heard in Washington would not be overridden by massive unlimited campaign contributions from corporations and unions?
McCain was correct. Nobody believed that. But that was a feature of the Citizens United case, not a bug. A ruling in favor of Citizens United would override average citizens' voices and create a society run by corporations and oligarchs, just as James Bopp's fellow Hoosier, Ron Swanson, had dreamed of back in fictional small-town Indiana.
I think that all government is a waste of taxpayer money. My dream is to have the park system privatized and run entirely for profit by corporations, like Chuck E. Cheese. They have an impeccable business model. I would rather work for Chuck E. Cheese.
McCain, Feingold, and all the reformers warned that ruling for Citizens United would deregulate the campaign finance system and basically make Ron Swanson's vision a reality. Politicians and public officials would work for Chuck E. Cheese and every other corporation, and those corporations would be allowed to buy elections. I mean, the Supreme Court was pretty radical, but would it really go that far? That's after the break.
In case 08205, Citizens United versus the FEC, Justice Kennedy has the opinion of the court.
On January 21st, 2010, just over 4 months after the second round of arguments, the decision in Citizens United came down. This time, it wasn't Chief Justice John Roberts writing the majority opinion. It was the old Sacramento Swamp Thing, former lobbyist and influence peddler Anthony Kennedy. In announcing the decision to the public, Kennedy first laid out why the majority had decided to go big. He identified the precedents that were relevant to the case, like the court's ruling a few years prior that had held up the McCain-Feingold campaign finance law. And then, he said,
"We conclude that those precedents now must be re-examined. The court has recognized that First Amendment protection extends to corporations. If the First Amendment has any force, it prohibits Congress from fining or jailing citizens or associations of citizens for simply engaging in political speech."
The precedents the court's majority was now dismantling, according to Kennedy,
would allow the government to ban corporations from expressing political views through any media, including media beyond those presented here, and in this case, such as by printing books. Political speech is indispensable to decision-making in a democracy, and this is no less true because the speech comes from a corporation rather than an individual.
This is the radical corporations or people concept on steroids, and the opinion was directly built from that Bellotti ruling first authored by Kennedy's immediate predecessor, Lewis Powell. Even more radical, Anthony Kennedy, who spent his early years as a lobbyist doling out campaign cash to sway legislators, that same Anthony Kennedy was now also insisting that money in politics was only corrupting when there was an explicit quid pro quo. But all the other things that Anthony Kennedy himself had helped his Sacramento lobbying clients use money to buy, stuff like access and influence, that stuff was apparently not corrupting. That sounds like an exaggeration, but in his written opinion, Kennedy asserted that campaign donors, quote, may have influence over or access to elected officials, but that did not, quote, mean that these officials are corrupt. And then Kennedy wrote something so crazy that, hold on. Can I get a special effect on my voice for this so that it sounds extra evil? Okay, there we go. Kennedy said, quote,
independent expenditures, including those made by corporations, do not give rise to corruption or the appearance of corruption.
I mean, think about how insane that is. Anthony Kennedy non-ironically wrote a ruling with the force of law that essentially declares that when a corporation spends $50 million blanketing your state to help one candidate win a U.S. Senate election, there's no corruption or even appearance of corruption when that candidate then does legislative favors for that corporation. Justice Stevens wrote the dissent on behalf of the liberals. It may not have been Souter's barn burner, but it was pretty close. It was 90 pages long and probably bolstered by the fact that Stevens was 90 years old and also nearly ready to retire.
As one of the joint authors of the opinion in McConnell, I must emphatically disagree with today's law-changing decision.
Stevens' dissent made the point that up until O'Connor and Rehnquist were replaced by Roberts and Alito, the court had upheld at least some restrictions on corporate spending in elections.
The court has the point exactly backwards. At the founding, Americans took it as a given that corporations could be comprehensively regulated in the service of the public welfare. It is doubtful that the framers believed the freedom of speech would extend to corporations who cannot themselves engage in speech, and it is even more doubtful that when they ratified the First Amendment, they thought they were laying down a principle that could be used to insulate corporations from even modest restrictions on electioneering expenditures.
After speaking for 20 minutes, twice as long as Kennedy had, Stevens had his mic drop moment.
While American democracy is still imperfect, few outside the majority of this court would have thought its flaws included a shortage of corporate money in politics.
Unsurprisingly, when the ruling came down, David Bossie of Citizens United was giddy.
This is a monumental day for Citizens United, and more importantly for the First Amendment and the fundamental rights of people to participate in the political process and the marketplace of ideas. Whether you're an individual, whether you're a corporation or a union, it doesn't matter. You can now participate fully and freely in the election process.
Here's Senator Sheldon Whitehouse again.
My recollection is that I was on the Senate floor and came back to read the decision.
He said the decision was painful to read.
I live in the immediate political world, and I was watching the Supreme Court buy into a notion about that political world that I knew to be false. They have applied a conceptual paradigm over politics that is complete and utter nonsense.
While much of the country reacted to the decision with surprise and anger, Whitehouse says that conservative must have had an inkling that this was coming, because right after the decision came down, conservative and business interest groups immediately filed papers to create scores of unregulated dark money groups that could exploit the ruling.
The fact that they had this whole 501c4 apparatus ready to go sort of proved that this was an expected decision. In fact, you even have Virginia Thomas setting up her organization while the decision is being deliberated so that on the day it's announced, she's ready to go.
Whitehouse is referring to Virginia Ginny Thomas, wife of Justice Clarence Thomas. Just weeks before the ruling in Citizens United came down, she and Leonard Leo of the Federalist Society filed initial paperwork for a not-for-profit lobbying group called Liberty Central, a group designed to take advantage of the Citizens United ruling.
Liberty Central is America's public square. We inspire, we listen, we activate ordinary citizens to secure the blessings of liberty.
Though it was hidden at the time, later reporting revealed that Liberty Central's initial $500,000 of funding came from, who else? The Thomases' favorite billionaire, a guy named Harlan Crow, who'd been funding lavish trips for Justice Thomas. On the other side of the aisle, Democrats openly criticized the Citizens United ruling. Here's President Obama in his State of the Union address less than a week after the decision.
Last week, the Supreme Court reversed a century of law that I believe will open the floodgates for special interests, including foreign corporations, to spend without limit in our elections.
In the video of the speech, you can see the justices stay seated and look stone-faced as much of the room stands to applaud Obama around them. And then there's Samuel Alito shaking his head and muttering, "Not true."
It made me grieve for Sandra Day O'Connor, whose departure had opened the door for Alito particularly, and whose common sense and experience as somebody who had run for office, I think, would have headed off Citizens United had she stayed on the court. So the whole thing was just sort of imbued with sorrow and missed chances. But the result at the end was a completely manufactured simulacrum of what the political world is like, created by the court and imposed on all of us.
Whitehouse and John McCain tried to quickly limit the ruling's effects. They asked the Supreme Court to at least prevent a lower court in Montana from now using Citizens United to gut that state's 100-year-old anti-corruption law. The Supreme Court refused to even hear the case.
So at that point, I realized, oh my God, this is not an innocent mistake. They are actually deliberately trying to open our political world to right-wing political dark money.
In my imagination, James Bopp was celebrating back home in Indiana when he read the Citizens United ruling.
Great job, everyone. The reception will be held in each of our individual houses alone.
But alas, James Bopp wasn't there. He was actually on the beach.
I don't even remember why I was in Florida, but I remember very distinctly reading the opinion on the beach in Florida. Of course, I already knew the decision that they'd overturned the two precedents that needed to be overturned, and I knew the vote.
He was psyched, but if he doesn't sound 100% excited about the ruling, it's because he kind of wasn't. Sure, he had gotten most of what he wanted. He had created a case that convinced the court to go huge and eviscerate campaign finance laws in a world-changing ruling. 4 years before Citizens United, nonprofits and other non-disclosing political groups had spent $0 in the 2006 election cycle. In 2010, right after the ruling, those groups accounted for 47% of political spending, $134 million. But still, there was one part of the Citizens United ruling that stuck in James Bopp's craw.
They upheld the report.
The disclosure.
Yeah, the disclosure report.
Remember, David Bossie originally asked Bopp to help his group circumvent the McCain-Feingold law and let Citizens United air its glorified anti-Hillary campaign ad in the middle of the election. But Bossie also told Bopp he wanted to ignore the McCain-Feingold law's disclosure provisions and hide the names of the ad's funders from the public. On that disclosure issue, the court actually ruled against Citizens United. The court ruled that laws requiring big spenders in elections and politics to be disclosed, those laws were constitutional.
We reject Citizens United's challenge to the disclaimer and disclosure provisions. Those mechanisms provide information to the electorate. The resulting transparency enables the electorate to make informed decisions and give proper weight to different speakers and different messages.
When he heard this caveat, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse saw an opportunity to call the Supreme Court's bluff. He introduced a bill called the Democracy is Strengthened by Casting Light on Spending in Elections Act, a hilariously wordy attempt to get a pithy acronym, the Disclose Act.
The Disclose Act was originally designed to require that you trace back to the actual source of political contributions for any contribution to a political campaign or a PAC or a super PAC over $10,000 in an individual race. That's not a whole lot of people, but at that level you really are buying influence, and so I think it's important for voters to understand what's going on in their political world around them.
Democrats rallied behind the Disclose Act right away, while Republicans, like Mitch McConnell, contorted themselves to swat it down.
This Disclose Act is not about reform. It's nothing more than Democrats sitting behind closed doors with special interest lobbyists choosing which favored groups they want to speak in the 2010 elections.
But McConnell and the other master planners were not satisfied just stopping the Disclose Act in the Senate and walking off into the sunset with the Citizens United ruling. If your movement's half-century goal is to completely deregulate the campaign finance system and legalize the buying of elections so that a handful of anonymous big spenders could completely control politics, what more could you possibly want after Citizens United? Well, one answer to that question is something that was baked into the Citizens United case by the master planner's favorite justice of all. The guy that we now know was being secretly wined and dined by billionaires, Clarence Thomas. In a concurrence that almost nobody noticed, Thomas voted for the ruling, but said he thought it didn't go far enough. He said, wait, hang on. Can I get that evil voice special effect one more time?
Okay.
He wrote, quote,
"This court should invalidate mandatory disclosure and reporting requirements."
So if you're a master planner, maybe after Citizens United, you want to try to do that. Kill off all disclosure. And maybe you also want to hobble the last remaining campaign finance regulators on the beat. And maybe, just maybe, you want to try to get the government to declare that cash for favors, like actual money for actual political favors, is now completely legal.
In the day's other news, the U.S. Supreme Court lent a seemingly sympathetic ear to former Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell. He faces 2 years in prison for accepting thousands of dollars in gifts and loans from a businessman. But in today's arguments, both liberal and conservative justices suggested the federal bribery law is overboard.
That's next time on Master Plan.
up a master plan. I've earned everything I've got. Thinking of a master plan. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Master Plan is a production of The Lever. This episode was written by Ula Culpa and me, David Sirota. Our editor is Ron Doyle. Our production team includes Jared Mayer, Laura Krantz, Arjun Singh, and Ronnie Riccobene. Fact-checking of this episode by Chris Walker. Original music is by Nick Byron Campbell. Mixing by Louis Weeks. Special thanks to James Bopp and Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. You can listen and subscribe to Master Plan on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, YouTube Music, or wherever else you get your podcasts. For ad-free episodes, exclusive bonus content, transcripts with links to our sources, and access to The Lever's entire archive of investigative journalism, please visit levernews.com to become a subscriber.